All statements and opinions expressed by guests of this podcast are not representative of the Orthochat, its host, or its producers, and should not be associated with the podcast unless explicitly stated by the host.
You are listening to the Orthochat by Yanni Katsadas.
Kyrie Christe eleison, 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 Kyrie Christe eleison.
Greetings in Christ, brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode 39 of the Orthochat. We are here with Father Jacob Siemens. Father, how are you?
Very well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Father. Would you like to start us off with a prayer?
I can think of no better than in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly King, Advocate, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, bestower of life, come and dwell within us. Cleanse us of all that defiles us, and, O good one, save our souls.
Amen. Father, before we get started, what's up? What's new?
What's new? Well, I had the privilege of hosting Father Andrew Stephen Damick here in Wales as he undertook his Welsh pilgrimage, which he will be broadcasting in short order. And this entailed exploring corners of Wales I didn't know existed, despite the fact that I've lived here for 20 years and thought I knew the land fairly well. But, Wales is replete with holy wells and holy sites. And it just impressed on me the fact that, we are walking on holy ground. And it just reinvigorated my sense of mission in this place as an Orthodox priest.
Yeah, the last time I was in the United Kingdom was last year, and the only place I was able to see was inside the London airport. But and to my displeasure, I haven't been able to see more of it. From what I've been told by many people, including you, it's a wonderful place, and I really plan on seeing the theological heritage of a place that needs to be observed more fondly and I guess more observantly going forward, because there's an entire religious subculture there that has its roots in Orthodoxy that a lot of people just don't know about.
Very much so. The first 10 centuries of Christian history, and of course, as that pertains to Britain in particular, that's a good 8 of 10 centuries of history that are Orthodox. And, what a foundation to build upon today. It makes our job a joyful one.
I agree. And, concerning your foundation, I wanted to ask you about your early life and what were your religious views and experiences like during that time?
Great question. I was raised in a Christian home, and my father had an Anabaptist background. He was a German Mennonite, and my grandparents, his parents, came to Canada from what is today Ukraine. They were from the region around Zaporizhia, and they fled in the wake of the turmoil of the revolution. But while my dad was raised in that faith tradition, when he married my mother, who is a British Canadian, he became Anglican. And so my own background is just that. It was Anglican, of a Catholic and Orthodox sort. So I grew up in a faith that was very much characterized by ritual, uh, and but in a living way. In other words, it was no sort of what you might call an Anglo-Catholic museum piece. The parish in which I grew up subscribed to the sort of worldview, you might say, of the Book of Common Prayer. And the Canadian Book of Common Prayer is more easy to interpret in a Catholic way than perhaps the Book of Common Prayer people often think about, the 1662 English book, because it involved more sort of additions uh, from the that arose from the 19th century Catholic revival in the Anglican Church. But I just grew up loving what what I was experiencing, and that very much corresponded with a sense of God's presence in my life that I had from the time of my earliest memories. So, when I don't know what other kids thought about lying upon their bed as 3-year-olds, but I just remember growing up with a sense that Christ was quite literally with me. And so I've always just spoken to him and felt a sense that, God's presence was a real thing. So I simply carried that through from childhood through my teenage years. I never really went through that phase stereotypical of teenagers of walking away or turning away from the church. I never thought it was silly. Um, it was something that informed, every aspect of my life. Not to say for one moment I was never naughty, because I certainly was. I was just, as any other child, as any other young person. But uh, it was, you might say, it was naughty in a context. It was always with a sense that, what I'm doing now may not be the best thing, and it's something I need to offer up and repent of. So it was like an ongoing conversation with the reality of God around me.
Right. I wish that I had that same kind of clarity during my adolescence that you did, and
Mm.
that perception of, what am I doing, is it pleasing to God or not? And I think all parents wish for their children to have that. So you grew up Anglican, and then I believe you ended up at some point being called to the priesthood. So, what was it like when you received your calling to the clergy, and did you accept this calling immediately? And what does the Anglican priesthood even look like?
Yeah, the priesthood, as I understood it from my infancy, really, is not that much different to the way we understand it as Orthodox Christians. Um, Forget notions of the branch theory that people will talk about. When you grow up in a context and you just accept it, it's not about theories. You just assume that, I had a diocesan bishop who also happened to be the Metropolitan Archbishop, and a priest and various sort of assistant priests and deacons from time to time, assuming what would be really very close to an Orthodox worldview. I didn't know, as naive as this sounds, I didn't know really that I wasn't a Catholic or an Orthodox Christian until I was a late teenager. Um, I know uh, how ludicrous that might sound to some, but it was just a happy upbringing in a parish church um, where the sacraments were truly lived and adhered to, and there was a sense of healthy discipline and a framework in which to live the Christian life. So it was in that context that I felt a pull towards priesthood. And that goes back again all the way to my earliest memories. That 3-year-old lying on his bed at night, praying to God in the darkness of the bedroom, was the same kid that felt he wanted to do what that guy up on the altar on Sunday was doing. And this is borne out by the fact that I think even to this day, were you to ask my mother, she has as I suspect most mothers do, a box of things that their children do when they're little. And there are pictures of me that I drew in what we North Americans will call kindergarten. You know, pictures that I drew of myself scuba diving with a huge pectoral cross hanging around my neck. Because I swore that I was going to be a priest and scuba diving was going to be my preferred method of commuting. Um, so it's as early as that. As I moved into my teenage years, I was always very interested in law. And I, when I was thinking about careers, when I was thinking about sort of ways forward, even in school, my friendship group was not judgmental, and I had no hesitation in putting down either lawyer or priest. And so we'd go to careers fairs, and I was always disappointed that there was no church stall. It was always this or that legal firm. But I was immersed in law and politics and sort of thought that that would be the direction I would head in material terms, because you don't think necessarily about the priesthood as being a way to sustain, for example, a family. But I started university right out of high school, and you'll know as a fellow North American that the system there is not that you go straight into law, but that you do an undergraduate first. So I was taking politics and I can't even, oh, and history with a view of then going into law. But I still had the church on my mind. I took one particular elective um, because circumstantially a language course I had wanted to take wasn't available. And that elective was in the Department of Religious Studies, as it was, and ended up falling in love with the material immediately. And before the first semester had finished, I had visited my archbishop to express my interest in pursuing a vocation to the priesthood. So it was one continuous trajectory from my toddler bed to sitting in front of the archbishop. And so my studies then veered from uh, the political and pre-legal to religious studies and history. I finished my undergraduate uh, in in that course, so that I have a major in religious studies and minor in history. And I then got married. I'd been dating a beautiful young woman since high school, and we sort of knew that that was where we were going to end up. So we got married early at the age of 21, and almost immediately then packed our bags and left Winnipeg in the center of Canada for Montreal in the east, which is where my archbishop had directed me to study theology. So went off to McGill University and the theological college attached to McGill. And sort of the way the system there worked, it was essentially studying 2 degrees in one. So I was studying at McGill and at the college simultaneously, and finished then with a second undergraduate in theology and a master's of divinity, which you may know is a standard North American professional master's in
Clerical
preparation.
prerequisite, yeah.
Yeah. So I did that. And while I was doing it, I fell in love with sort of more rigorous theological study, and intended then on carrying on to postgraduate level. But in the meantime, I was ordained to the diaconate, went off to serve in the West Indies. So I was on the island of St. Kitts. I didn't manage to stay down there. I
What was that
found
like?
it was challenging. It was very beautiful. The challenge was both theological and cultural. Cultural because we just weren't prepared. I had traveled quite a bit as a young person, but we were by then 26. my wife was pregnant with our first child, and I perhaps wasn't ready to leave Montreal. I had fallen in love with that city. I say Winnipeg is where I grew up, but Montreal is where I became a man. And I had really begun to encounter Orthodoxy in a very serious way in Montreal. Had in fact spent time meeting with a couple of priests, was thinking about becoming Orthodox then, um, but was continuing on the Anglican path. Went off to the West Indies with Orthodoxy on my mind, but with you might say Anglicanism in my feet and in my hands due to ordination, and was serving always with a mixed heart. And that was an internal struggle, but it all lent to making the time down there quite challenging. As I say, our first child was then born down there. We felt profoundly lonely in a way we just did not expect. And so before my first year was up, we'd almost completed the first year, but before it was up, I submitted my resignation and we returned to Canada. I had no particular direction because, I mean, who wants not literally disgraced, but in light terms at least, who wants a disgraced deacon, one who couldn't complete his first year in his curacy? But the Anglican Bishop of Saskatchewan called me and he said, "Look, I've got an open parish. Why don't you come serve up here? I will ordain you priest, and you can work out some of the things that you've discovered um, while you're serving, and you can do so amongst a brotherhood of priests that will support you." So I took him up on that, moved to northern Saskatchewan, a place I never thought I would be, and had 5 very happy, constructive years of growth as a young priest in northern Saskatchewan then. As that time was coming to an end, I knew Orthodoxy for me by then was going to be, well, it was probably always a matter of when, not if. That is not to say I took my Anglican work, my Anglican ministry, um, with any form of cynicism. I was not, I was seeking to engage in that with sincerity, with love, and with all of the diligence that it deserved. But the bug I had caught in Montreal, the inclination towards Orthodoxy never left me. Moved on then to the Church of England because I was offered a chance to serve there, and so left Saskatchewan, took up a position as a priest in a parish in northern England. But by then, I think the writing was on the wall, and well, that's when things became perhaps in some ways simpler, but in many ways more complicated. I was by now immersed in doctoral studies and was working very closely with figures such as Saint Irenaeus, was, reading his emphasis on the See of Rome as being a locus of unity and an assurance of orthodoxy in the church, and was taking that very seriously. So you might say I was too clever by half, and was looking at the Roman Church as a possibility, not because I'd ever had any interest, like never really across any of my formation that I had any interest in the Roman Church, but with Irenaeus's words sort of ringing in my head, I discovered the Uniates, the Ukrainian Greek Catholics in particular, and sort of thought, well, there, I can have my cake and eat it. I can have this communion with Rome, but be Orthodox.
Can you
Well,
describe that for people, that jurisdiction of the Ukrainian Greek Catholics? Because I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with that of its existence at all.
okay. Everybody will be familiar with the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church is essentially the default apostolic church in the West. In other words, Its roots are in its apostolic foundation, going back to the earliest days of the church, and of course Saint Peter and Saint Paul. But it in the particularly in the 16th century um, started to move into Eastern lands. And in the encounter between the Orthodox churches of those Eastern lands and the aggression of Rome and Rome's missions there, um, various agreements were struck. So there was between the Roman Catholic Church and the Western Orthodox churches of Belarus and Western Ukraine in particular, an agreement. The one I'm thinking of is the Union of Brest. And in the Union of Brest, the Orthodox churches of the Western Slavic world entered into communion with Rome in a way that was primarily strategic. Their desire was to stop sort of the aggressive Latin missions as they pushed east, while maintaining their own integrity and their own traditions as Orthodox churches.
To be the wall again from Rome against the Eastern Orthodox world that was to the right of them, per se.
Precisely, that's exactly right. But of course, in the process, they were giving up their Orthodox integrity. That may not have been in the intention, but it was a swift process. Um, in the late 19th and across the 20th century, there were many moves from Rome to encourage these Eastern Catholic churches, as we now call them, to re-Byzantinize. In other words, to get rid of Latin accretions, to get rid of the sort of hybridization that occurred in their midst. Um, and while superficially those initiatives have been successful in some places, as I very quickly learned, orthodoxy in form is not orthodoxy. Orthodoxy must be orthodox in content as well. In other words, you can't just be an Eastern Catholic and be Orthodox. You are, inherently chained to a Roman theological world, a Roman or a Latin spiritual world that constrains that orthodoxy. So,
And the
uh,
pontiff by extent.
absolutely. And, this became clear to me very quickly after we had left the Anglican altar to become Eastern Catholic. But my feeling was I had made my bed and I had to lie in it. And that hurt. It hurt my family. It hurt me. That is not to say for a moment that we're not very sincere Christians of Orthodox intent within the Eastern Catholic world. It is to say, however, that um, there came to be no question in my mind that I was not in an Orthodox church.
But you were
I
figuring it out. It was a process of, I guess, discovery in a way.
That's charitably put on your part, and I thank you for it. Yes, but at the same time, I had seen so many young men, especially when I was in Montreal, who were always looking for the perfect church, and they were always on the move. And I swore to myself I wasn't going to be one of those people. I had always sort of thought that proclaimed a certain kind of spiritual instability, and I thought, how can I avoid doing that? And I thought, well, one way is to accept the fact that I've landed in the wrong place and just get on with being the best Orthodox Christian I can be despite my circumstances. But after 15 years in that situation, a good number of circumstances arose that made it clear to me this was untenable. And it was also, as I've already indicated, it was hurting my family as well. And I realized this could not continue. So I decided that I would just I would maintain standing within the church, but I would essentially hang up the vestments and just get on with picking up some peripatetic theological teaching in light of my academic background. When a dean, the then dean of the jurisdiction to which I now belong, his name is Father Timothy Curtis, he called me out of the blue. And he said, I see you're doing some online theological teaching. I'm just calling to explore whether or not some of what you offer might be of use to the deanery for which I have pastoral care. And we talked, and at the end of our conversation, he said, well, and tell me, how are you doing? And well, the floodgates opened. I just poured it all out to him, and he listened very attentively. And he said, well, look, um, I'm here if you need to talk. So we hung up, and the next week, I I took him seriously. I called him again, and again he listened attentively. We hung up. It was probably about 1 in the afternoon on a Sunday, and that Sunday evening, my phone went. It was him, and he'd said, "I know you didn't ask me to, but I've spoken with Metropolitan Jean in Paris." And told him about you. He says that subject to due diligence checks, he will be happy to receive you on the altar in Paris. And I hung up and I looked at my wife. I'm not given to tears very easily. But I looked at my wife and I just welled up. I said, I can't believe this. Um, So Father Timothy undertook his due diligence checks, which took maybe a couple of weeks. He got references from various people, including a priest with whom I remained close in Montreal, but who had been with me from the beginning of my Orthodox journey 30 years earlier. And Father Timothy called then to confirm that everything checked out and Metropolitan Jean would receive me. So I flew over to Paris on the 16th of December 2020 and was received on the altar by him on the 17th.
So you're
So that
fresh.
I'm fresh. I'm not fresh in terms of Christian ministry. That goes back almost 30 years, but I'm fresh in terms of my life as an Orthodox priest. Absolutely.
Glory be to God. And I want to ask later on about the similarities that you've seen between all the denominations and all the places that you've been and you served in. But what and I also but before that I kind of wanted to ask about your experience serving people in Ukraine and what you learned from working in a place like that. It seems very, I would think, foreign to a lot of people considering it's like, for somebody that's in the United States or in Canada, they may see, Italy and Greece as essentially the same thing and Ukraine and surrounding countries in a similar fashion, but me and you both know that's not true. So tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about that.
Well, first, just to be clear, I served in the Eparchy of the Holy Family of London, which is the UK diocese. Having said that, I did in fact travel to Ukraine on a number of occasions. So I had close relationships with people there and also spent time there. A fair amount, actually. I was quite fortunate. That said, the Ukrainian situation, and I'm not talking about the political situation that we're aware of now, I'm just talking about culturally, is a very curious one because Western Ukrainians in particular carry with them long memories. And sometimes that is quite warranted, and sometimes that is much, I think, to their detriment, primarily because it identifies, I think anthropologically, first and foremost, we are children of God. We're created in the image of God.
That's the
And then
universal
we are
standard, yeah.
Yeah. So then we are male and female. Then we are, dedicated followers of Christ. And then, maybe we're, a nationality. But basically, the idea of nationality has to come a good few steps down on that hierarchy of identities. But at times, for Western Ukrainians in particular, I think the trizub, that is the Ukrainian national symbol, rises up much higher than it should be, and it creates an unhealthy sense of identity. And it would be like me as an expatriate Canadian of mixed origin, you know, getting up and before thinking about the cross over my bed, instead looking at the maple leaf on my dresser. You know, I don't have one, by the way, but rhetorically speaking, um, that would not be a very, healthy thing. And if my parishioners, for example, thought that I had such reverence for the maple leaf, they would be right to question my suitability as a Christian priest. The fact is, I have affection for where I was born and raised, and I'm thankful for the experiences I had there. But my children, although they hold Canadian passports as well as British passports, they're not Canadian. That's not their identity. And yet, you can meet grandchildren of Ukrainians in the United Kingdom who talk about their country, meaning Ukraine. And this blows my mind. I entirely accept an affection for, even a pride in, sort of an inheritance. There's
Heritage.
nothing wrong with that. Yeah. I mean, we should rejoice in that because it gives us things to draw on as we move through life, gives us language, it gives us food, it gives us dance, it gives us the fundamental human pleasures that our Lord himself enjoyed as a first century Middle Easterner, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But when those things come to displace our first and foremost vocation as human beings, as children of God, as Christians, then it becomes a problem. And I saw that probably more in the Ukrainian milieu than I expected to, and far more than I thought healthy.
Yeah. I mean, I think in part it's an Eastern European thing. I mean, as a Greek, I understand that sentiment, and I see a lot of people um deal with that, whether they make themselves beholden to it or whether they try to push back against it. I'm certainly guilty of it in portions of my life, but I think it comes down to a fundamental and very human concept of you are beholden to what you give yourself over to.
Hmm.
And if you give yourself over to your country, that is the subject of your primary directives. But I think when it concerns Christ, Christ is the only thing that you can give yourself over to that compels you to make his will your priority.
Hmm.
Because if you give yourself over to the state, you kind of tell yourself constantly, this is right, this is right, this is right. You give yourself over to any base human pleasures, even your family in ways, you have to constantly tell yourself this is the thing that I'm supposed to do. But the only thing that offers positive reinforcement for behavior, actions, thought, interactions between other human beings is giving yourself over to Christ, who will then encourage you consistently throughout your life to say that there is no wondering
Hmm.
of whether this is right or wrong. This is what you're supposed to be doing, and I am with you on this mission for the sake of your own soul and for the sake of the souls around you. I think, at least.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we always have to, as C.S. Lewis says in The Last Battle, through the mouth of Aslan to the children, higher up and farther in. We have to go higher and farther than the more base sort of elements of identity would otherwise keep us rooted.
I agree. And I think that applies to the spiritual life as well. I think that might even speak to your own experience as a now Orthodox Christian, because something that I always try articulating to people, and I fail at constantly, about the comparison between Orthodox Christianity and other denominations is what I guess I would call the ceiling, right?
Mhm.
When we look at Protestants, even high church denominations of Protestantism, if you take the ideal, the best, I guess, Reformed Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, Anglican, who are doing their best and who do sincerely love Christ, um, and you take that same thing for the best ideal Catholic, and you take the same thing for the best ideal Orthodox Christian, they look very different because there's a certain limit that you could hit in those Protestant denominations, and maybe there's a higher limit you can hit in Catholicism, but with Orthodoxy, it's such a wide and pretty much infinite spectrum. Well, I mean, practically infinite because the ideal is Christ and Christ is somewhere and we're constantly underneath that. You see people on every level of it. You see people who who are just Christmas, Easter, and a couple feast days a year to monastically oriented laity to people who will go on to be ordained saints in the next 7 to 15 years. And I think that scale is one of the most attractive parts of Orthodoxy that people kind of catch when they finally make the decision to come over here. It's you have all of this space to grow, and the difference between point A, point B, point C, all the way down to letters that don't even exist is mind blowing.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you've been to a lot of places and you've gone through plenty, but what I wanted to ask is what does your ministry look like today and how might it be unique compared to Orthodoxy in other parts of the world?
I think being in Britain, a place that has an Orthodox foundation, but which has largely forgotten it through 10 centuries of some turmoil, it's a ministry of rediscovery. Partly, I have to say, rediscovery for me, but primarily of leading others in rediscovery. Wales, in particular, is a country that I revel in. It's been a place from which I've been able to draw just immense joy. And as I think I indicated when we first started speaking, it's also a place of, just great holiness in terms of its Christian origins. And this foundation continues to almost literally by means of the holy wells that I've just spent a couple of weeks exploring, keep seeping up through the ground. At exactly the same time, there's a certain social amnesia or religious amnesia in the sense that, um, what that church represented, what that faith represented, has been displaced or forgotten. So you can hardly move in this small country without, passing a holy well, whether you're in the cities, whether you're in the sort of rural parts of the country. You definitely can not drive more than a few miles without coming upon a place prefixed with the word "clan," which means church of. So, this whole, the whole country is full of saints. And um, I was just reading, there's a Saints Project. I think it's initiated by the National University or National Library of Wales, but whether I've got that right or not, it's a Saints Project. And it said that, Wales is the land of thousands of saints. And I cannot remember what kind of numbers we're
Today is
talking,
St.
but
Columba too, I think, right? Yeah.
St. Columba is Irish.
St. Columba's Irish, my mistake.
Yeah. But there's a great deal of cross-fertilization between Ireland, Wales, and Scotland as well. So you're not wrong to associate these great figures. The the fact is, though, by virtue of what I'm going to call the Latin captivity, in other words,
Love that. Love that term.
Um, it laid the groundwork for um, a certain kind of forgetfulness towards the ancient past. And certainly, pardon me, certainly by the time of the Reformation, the the saints whose names today we hardly remember were were almost entirely shelved in favor of the more immediate and the more sort of contemporary to the time. And so, the Catholic witness in these lands now is, I would say, primarily focused on what they call the recusant saints, that is, the Catholics who hung on to Catholicism in the face of the Reformed Church that was spreading throughout England and Wales. And if not that, then it's looking to continental Catholicism for its inspiration. So you'll get a parish church named for somebody like Saint John Fisher or Saint uh, goodness, I can't even remember the name of these Reformation period saints, but you'll get churches named for them, or you'll get churches named for 19th century Spaniards. And you're like, what does any of this have to
Have to
do?
do with us, yeah.
But yeah, exactly. The Anglicans, and I'm unspeakably thankful for this, have been sort of custodians of an earlier memory. So all of the medieval churches, all of the earlier churches, all of the earlier holy sites that go back much, much further. Well, those are, of course, all in the possession of the church in Wales, the Anglican church here, but they're also lovingly maintained, right? And they're also kept accessible, which is precisely why the pilgrimage with Father Andrew Stephen Damick over the last 2 weeks was possible. We were able to go into so many of these buildings and venerate the relics of ancient saints because the doors are open, because the churches are kept up, because the shrines are remembered, and where they were destroyed at the Reformation, they've been restored, or at least where they couldn't be restored and the relics were perhaps lost, there is a note there to say this was the resting place of Saint so and so. And you're able then to be in contact with your holy forebears. And that's then where we Orthodox take it up. We're able to proclaim these holy forebears and say, they're not just memories, they're living companions in the faith. And we then commemorate them within our communities. So my own parish is named for Saint Theodore and Saint Tylo. Saint Theodore is the 7th century Archbishop of Canterbury. He came from, as his name, Saint Theodore of Tarsus suggests, from the Greek-speaking East, Asia Minor. And Saint Tylo, who is a 6th century saint and patron of the city of Cardiff. So, we draw on their names not because we're simply remembering them in some intellectual sense, but because we place ourselves under their patronage and look to these truly British Christian figures, Orthodox British Christian figures, for help, guidance, and companionship.
Right. And something that I want to ask more before I actually get to that about your travels with Father Damick and where and some of the relics that you were able to venerate and some of, I guess, the holy sites you were able to see. What were those and what was that like?
Well, it started on day one with what was supposed to be just a light day here in Cardiff itself. You can imagine that Father Andrew was fairly discombobulated having walked off a plane, although I was amazed at his resilience because he was up despite a lack of sleep and ready to go in the morning. But so day one, we actually just went straight up to Llandaff Cathedral, which is probably only a half mile from my house. And we there, because Llandaff Cathedral actually has a very important relic. It's the skull of St. Tylo. And we were able to go in there with the encouragement and warm reception of the guides in the church. We were able to go in there and venerate the relic of Saint Tylo and sing a troparion and offer a prayer. And then we walked around the beautiful building, left, went outside, found St. Tylo's well, which is marked and still flowing. After that, we hopped in the car and went out to Caerleon. Now, Caerleon is a Roman settlement, a very early Roman settlement, and one that has proven um, to be of immense archaeological significance. It actually has an amphitheater that has been uncovered. Um, I don't think a Roman coin found by a hobbyist metal detectorist is even of significance anymore because the place is just dripping with coinage and with weaponry and that kind of thing. But more important, perhaps, about Caerleon is that it is the site of the martyrdoms of Saints Aaron and Julius. These are our British proto-martyrs, and their names are often forgotten, actually, because we tend to think of Saint Alban as being the proto-martyr of Britain, but they're at least as early, if not earlier. And what their exact histories are, we don't know, except that they were martyred. They lost their lives for Christ in Caerleon, this Roman settlement. So we were able to commemorate that and also just enjoy the amphitheater and walk around touching the ancient stones before then going back to my place and taking a rest until we could get started the next day. It was then really that things uh, just moved forward, at a rapid pace. We made our way north to visit a priest of the Diocese of Suraj up there. His name is Father Daniel. He's a hieromonk, and he has been serving in the town in North Wales called Blaenau for over 30 years. He is a true Orthodox servant of Wales, and if I had anybody on whom I would want to model my own work, it would be him, because he really treats his ministry much as a 19th century Anglican vicar might treat his. And what I mean by that is he's entirely immersed in the community. He's a son of the area, so his first language is Welsh. For him, Orthodoxy is Welsh, and Welsh Christianity is Orthodox. And this is borne out in the language of the liturgy. This is borne out in the icons of the saints, so many of whom are Welsh saints, and in his knowledge of the land. We went out driving with him, and we could hardly turn a corner without him saying, "If we just turn in here for a moment," and then he would lead us off to another sacred site. On our way to see him, though, we stopped at the shrine of Saint Melangeth, um, who was who was a woman of whom I really only learned on this trip. I was aware of her. In fact, Mother Melangeth is a nun of our archdiocese who takes care of the shrine at Walsingham in England, which is a major Marian site. But because I believe she's Dutch, actually, I'm not sure why she took on the name Melangeth as a religious name. Nonetheless, she did. And I've always been slightly bemused by the fact that, of course, our archdiocese, being Paris-based as it is, would find this ancient Welsh saint hard to even pronounce, never mind sort of understand historically. But we went to her shrine, and it was incredible. we had to turn off a main A road that is a sort of a secondary highway, you might say, running through Wales, and drive up a, a, a an overgrown dirt lane, littered with pheasants and other very adorable fowl that were running in front of the car that made it hard to progress. But we then got to the an area where we could park just outside the walls of the church, and there is in the church built a beautiful shrine to Saint Malenga, and the opportunity to actually write prayers on a card and to place them under the shrine. So there again, Father Andrew led a troparion. We sang in her praise, and then just spent some time in prayer there before going outside and just imbibing the atmosphere. And it's not often sunny in Wales, but it was that day, so we actually got to do so in some comfort. And it was unspeakably glorious. It was wonderful. The area is beautiful, and that opportunity to commune with her was beautiful. We moved on from there to Holywell, which is the shrine of or the well of Saint Winifred in North Wales, right on the north coast, close to a town called Llandudno. Um, and that well is more developed. It's actually clothed, you might say, in a medieval or Gothic building, or in a Gothic enclosure, and it has an air of antiquity about it in terms of the attraction it has held for Christians throughout the centuries, and still does. We then moved on from there to meet up with some others, a deacon from Father Daniel's parish, and then take our rest for the night. The next day, Anglesey and St. Cyril's Well, where we were met by another Suraj priest named Father Joseph. That was wonderful. Um, every time we went to one of these wells, we would dip our pectoral crosses in the water and make the sign of the cross and douse ourselves in the water. But being in the environment, being able to physically engage with with these miraculous waters that have been um, nourishing people across 1500 years in many cases, was was an experience unlike any other. It was incredible. So from there, then we went down to a saint whose name I cannot remember. You'll have to forgive me, but one of the reasons I can't is because if you know Welsh orthography at all, um, what to an English or Latin alphabet is a consonant is often either a vowel or else it's a diphthong that makes a different sound. And so the name doesn't necessarily stick in my mind. But we went to a place called Harlech, which boasts a beautiful Lord of the Rings like castle overlooking the sea. But up in the hills behind it was this well, and we had to make quite a climb in the car up a very, very narrow track. I wondered at times if the car would make it, but we finally got there, and the winds were blowing off the Irish Sea very fiercely. Nonetheless, we walked down to her well, a place that I'm sure was only known because we had Father Daniel with us, and we did the same thing there. And that was probably one of the most moving experiences. Yeah, I'm going to be posting, and I have been posting about a lot of this on social media so that any followers can keep track of it. I know Father Andrew Damick has been doing likewise in greater detail than I have. So if anybody wants to see what wells and what saints I'm talking about, they can simply look me up on social media and find it there, or perhaps better yet, look up Father Andrew Damick, and you'll see his chronicle. But from an experience point of view, incredible. There, I have no words.
Yeah, I will definitely be linking your social medias in the description of this video so people could check that out. And I must admit, as when we look at the behavior, the mindset of Western Christians, they look at places like the more ancient portions of the Slavic lands or Greece as kind of these very foreign and unknown parts to them theologically, which is true. And as a Greek, I have a certain interest and sense of affectionate novelty for Western Christianity because it's very foreign to me. And that's why I'm so happy to hear about it. And more than just hearing about it, I'm happy to know that there is such a deep and rich tradition that's being rediscovered and reacquainted with a lot of contemporary people. We see this in the interest in the Western Rite. We see this in um, not necessarily a rejection, I would say, but more of a looking for alternatives from the more traditionalized Greek style of liturgics and how people are shifting into something that might be a little more familiar for them. So it's encouraging and interesting to say the least. Now, speaking of the saints. I wanted to ask you on a personal level, in your spiritual life and in your work as a priest, what lives and teachings of the saints assist and encourage you the most?
Great question. And what I love, partly because of the emergence for me of Saint Theodore of Tarsus. And I did my doctoral work on him, and the postdoctoral work I did was related to that. So I've lived with him for a very long time. But when I first discovered him, it was through reading St. Bede's Ecclesiastical History. And I think it's in the fourth book, Bede introduces St. Theodore as a Greek monk living in Rome who is called upon to go to Canterbury. And Bede provides a very interesting detail. He says that Theodore was asked to, or he was required to stay behind in Rome for 3 months so that he could grow out his Eastern tonsure and be retonsured in the Western way.
Mm,
Now, what a curious detail to provide in a book that is meant to be about, the Christianity in the Anglo-Saxon world. But we also learn that the Pope is suspicious of Theodore and so sends Hadrian the African with him to Canterbury so that he might make sure that Theodore introduced no Eastern heresy into the English Church. What that actually referred to was the monothelite heresy that was going about at the time.
mm.
Ironically, Theodore was one of the most dedicated defenders of orthodoxy, and the Pope simply did not understand this. Theodore had been present, as we now know, at the Lateran Council of 649, which was led by no less than St. Maximus the Confessor. So we know of more than an association, an acquaintance between St. Theodore and St. Maximus. Theodore then, if you can imagine, this monk from Tarsus who ends up, studying in Antioch, then going to Edessa, being heavily influenced by Saint Ephrem, finding himself in Constantinople, where he then studies further, before then going to Rome, and then being sent to the far-flung edges of the empire, the Roman
All over the
Empire,
place, huh?
all over the place. And of course, he would have known the glories of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. And then he finds himself on the windswept coast of Kent, looking at a very humble stone building that is somehow meant to be a worthy temple. But he does. And he proves himself one of the most diligent, one of the most remarkable, one of the most adept administratively archbishops that the English Church had and has ever known. he teaches Greek and Latin. Um, St. Bede says a generation later that there were people in England who were still conversant in Greek and Latin as well as their own Anglo-Saxon tongue, entirely because of the teaching of St. Theodore. So this is unheard of and really unparalleled. So St. Theodore is my, he's the figure on whom I'm working academically, and yet, and this is very important, he becomes more than an academic figure to me. There is an iconographer here in Britain by the name of Aidan Hart. Many will have heard of him, I'm sure, but I've had the privilege of his acquaintance for a number of years. He's been very gracious with me, but he had painted, as far as I know, the first, or at least one of the first icons of St. Theodore. And I had that icon on my desktop, on my computer desktop, the whole time I was working on my thesis. And I was able to say to Aidan, once I finally finished that work, I was convinced that the Theodore he had painted was the Theodore of the literature, was the Theodore that I was writing about. Because I just felt like I got to know that saint. He has been a spiritual figure for me for a good number of years. And that's one of the reasons why when Metropolitan Jean sent me back to Wales after receiving me, he gave the blessing for carrying on a parish under the patronage of Saint Theodore. Um, Saint Bede, whom I've already mentioned, is a very big one. I think what I love about Bede and what I find so inspiring about him is that he was a scholar and an unrelenting lover of Christ. And indeed, he writes a very short autobiographical note at the end of the ecclesiastical history in which he describes his life as having begun when he was left at the monastery by his parents at the age of 7, and how he had never left the walls of the monastery, but he had never known such joy. And you just get this picture of somebody who found his entire life immersed in observing God's creation, which he did and which he expressed in his many works on science, and in the scriptures, which he did and expressed through his many commentaries, and in the simple and beautiful liturgical life of the monastery. So I suppose St. Theodore, the Venerable Bede, but of course many others, and I could go on at length. I would highlight those two as being of particular inspiration to me.
Yeah, I have a deep affection for the saintly name of Theodore, who my brother was named after, who passed away a number of
Oh.
years ago. He was named after Saint Theodore the Commander, but what you just said about Venerable Bede, how he knew no greater joy than anybody, even though he never left the walls of the monastery. What an example for us now living in the world where society offers us all these alternative I guess complacencies and sources of happiness when we as Orthodox Christians realize that the greatest joy is having Christ dwell within us.
Mm,
And that is the primary objective to reach for, even if it just means staying habitated in a cell and working through prayer. I mean, there's no higher truth than that, I think.
right.
Um, and in your personal life, have you met what you would call any particularly saintly or holy people, and maybe tell me a little bit about the impact that they left on you?
Yeah, I mean, my influences I have to state them because they extend back to my life as an Anglican. My first priest, the one who baptized me, is somebody who made an incredible mark on the Canadian landscape. And um, the guy was not perfect. I couldn't pretend for a moment. Many people, I'm sure, just found him plain old aggravating. But his um, just unrelenting faith, his energy that he never let up until he died in his 90s, just a few years ago. His name is Father Bob Green or Father Robert Green, was such that, you know, he he just never stopped reading, he never stopped praying, he never stopped um, going out and meeting his parishioners, whether they wanted to be met or not. In fact, the story of my own baptism is that my parents had not yet had me baptized. I don't know how many months old I was by then, but he had seen them on his parish list and went to their house. And when he got there, he said, "I'm your parish priest," to which my parents responded, "Which one?" And he said, "What?" But apparently they were, because they had moved, they were in transition between two parishes and they were sort of on the parish membership list at two different places. He said, "Well, I'm at," and this is the parish where I was baptized, St. Bede's. And my parents said, "Oh, right." So they invite him in, and he spies me in my, whatever baby carrier I was in. And he says, "And is that young one baptized?" And my parents said, "No, not yet." And he said, "Well, that will not do." So I was baptized very soon thereafter. And even after he left, I would have been 5 when he left the parish. Um, he stayed in touch with my family, but he also ended up particularly in one of Canada's most prominent Anglo-Catholic parishes, St. Bartholomew's in Toronto, where he undertook a very sort of public ministry. He and his wife were, you might even call them crazy, because none of what they did made any sense in terms of regard for personal safety. For example, St. Bartholomew's is in a very impoverished part of Toronto, but they opened their doors all the time to the homeless. They had a soup kitchen that they ran personally, not corporately, but personally. Um, Yet he served the daily mass and the hours morning and evening prayer. He was diligent in all of that work, while never hesitating to go out onto the streets and being there with the people in their need. And it was that kind of proactive um, apostolic activity that I was always aware of. And of course, I ended up meeting with him numerous times later in life as well, because he would come through Winnipeg on his journeys with his wife Marion, and stop by my house, and uh, we even visited with them, here in Britain. So he remains very much a large figure. Having said that, I should back up for a moment and add, this is a perennial Anglican question. When the time comes for you to leave Anglicanism, where do you go, Rome or Orthodoxy? Now, that's just something that especially Anglo-Catholics have in mind. It's because of their influences, and in some cases, the belief in what is called the branch theory, the idea that, there are three sort of episcopal ancient churches.
I'm sorry to
And
interrupt you, but do you think that a lot of Anglicans in their adult life anticipate leaving that denomination at one point or another?
yes, I would say so. I would say that you would find, especially among those whose Anglicanism is high. In other words, high church Anglicans, Anglo-Catholics, yes, very much so. And it's not a cynical question. That can sound very curious to somebody who isn't from that milieu, but um, it's just because of the proximity of the held faith with, with either the Catholic Church or with Orthodoxy, and and the fact that there is a dissonance between that held faith and the institution to which they belong. And I suspect that's always been the case, going right back to the dawn of uh, the emergence, I should say, of Anglicanism from the Latin Church at the Reformation. So, um, yes is my answer to your question. But I would just want to caution anybody listening to my answer that it's not a cynical thing, or it sounds bizarre, but it's actually because of a yearning for the ancient church, for
Oh,
the
of
apostolic
course.
church.
I
But
would never assume it's a hatred for something behind them, but a love for something that's right in front of them.
yeah, and thank you for phrasing it that way, because that's the way I would want to put it myself. Father Green's answer to that question was orthodoxy, and I was aware of that even as a child. So, although he remained an Anglican until his death a few years ago, he had planted seeds in me that I think just took root and grew throughout the course of my life. So yeah, I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful for many aspects of his example, of his priestly example. Um, Later, and perhaps more pertinent to my particular situation today, I would name a few people, some of which I don't want to embarrass. So I would refrain from naming them, but unless you really force me to. But the fact is,
Come on, I double dog dare you, just a little. Take the sin of crushing their humility a little bit. I'll put that on myself. I'll give you that much.
okay, I'll go for it. If you at least share that burden with me. This priest I mentioned in Montreal that I met when I was studying there for the Anglican priesthood. He was not yet a priest at the time. He had studied at St. Tikhon's in Pennsylvania, and he got married late. So I don't know if this is the reason why he wasn't ordained right out of seminary, but the fact is he wasn't ordained. He got married, and then he was ordained. But he has well, he's now retired, but he's still alive and well, thank God. And he's just been a very gentle mentor and friend to me. So when I was at seminary, he hired me to work at the bookshop where he was manager. And he had also done a master's in library science. So he's got this incredible mind for remembering the
Library
precise
science. I've
details
never
of
heard of
books.
such a thing.
It's a degree. I don't know if it's offered further afield, but certainly at McGill University, it's a specialism. And it's whatever it does to people, it gives them um, uh, an incredible mind for retaining book details and for understanding book networks and how to dig through footnotes. And so um, for that, I blame this particular priest, for because he set in motion in me the turning gears of orthodoxy as well as scholarship. I really started to fall in love with particularly patristic history and reading the fathers and you know relating those things to the world in which I was living. In other words, it wasn't just some kind of, exploration of a museum piece, but as something that was, a lived tradition. And he introduced me to that. His name is Father Gregory Nimogene. And now, Father Gregory, if you ever hear this, I ask you to forgive me. But as I say, he's now retired, and but alive and well, and we do communicate. So he would be one, and another would be Father Daniel, the aforementioned Welsh priest here. He's just you have to kind of see what he does to believe it. He goes about his work with immense sort of humility. He's very self-deprecating, but he's just a Welsh Orthodox priest. If anybody sort of manifests what it is to be an Orthodox Christian where and when you are, it would be him. And I just think that that kind of testimony is one on which I need to draw in order to be faithful the way I want to be faithful as well. Um, Now, I have some brother priests in my own diocese who have been incredibly fraternal and incredibly encouraging. So, my list could go on, but if I were to isolate two people in particular, I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but those would be the ones that come to mind.
Well, I would love to have discussions with your brother priests in the Orthodox Church where you're at someday on the podcast, God willingly, and maybe you could help me out with that a little bit.
With
Um,
pleasure.
and something that's kind of been, I guess, rotating in my mind for a while now, is the relationship between, I guess, the Anglican world and Orthodoxy, and something that really pronounced the potential existence of that for me was the coronation of the new King of England, where he had a Greek Orthodox psalter there,
Mhm.
um, participating in hymns for his coronation, and I was like, where is this coming from? And I was aware a little, at least a little bit before that, that the current king has a relationship with Mount Athos, and he has a connection with many Greek monastic communities. So, I I think it's also true that the Archbishop of Canterbury, even after I guess the schism, or at least after the Protestant Reformation, had communication with the arch with the Patriarch of Constantinople. So like what's the connection here in a very loose articulation of what I can ask? Do you see what I'm saying? It
A-
seems
Absolutely. Um, I can give you two answers to that question. And one is the sort of cold academic one, because I think we can trace a line through theological history and see how and why it's happened. The other is a spiritual one. I think that however secular British society is today, and it is, let there be no doubt, this memory, this real spiritual legacy left behind by all the saints we've been talking about, and which I encountered on the recent pilgrimage. Well, they continue to intercede for and have an effect on the land. I think that Britain, for some wonderful and strange reason, continues to benefit from maybe the prayers of those saints and from the fact that it's got an inescapable legacy. Because when I look at, continental Christian history, you know, Frankish history was very quickly Frankish and Latin. And I don't think that between the Italian peninsula and the northwest coast of Europe, um, you can escape that sort of Frankish influence, which at times can be actually quite negative.
as many
Britain,
Greeks will tell you.
yes, yeah, exactly. Um, but Britain is different, and its Christian history is different. Of course, it shares a great deal in common with what happened in the northwest of Europe. Um, but it's almost as if its pre-Anglo-Saxon origins, um, took took its cue from a different Christianity. Now we know archaeologically that that is partially the case because we know of the sort of trade and intercourse between Byzantine culture and Celtic culture. We have archaeological traces on the beaches of Cornwall and of South Wales, where Celtic tin went for various Byzantine treasures. But again, those are sort of the cold academic details. The fact is, it's it's it was fed by a stream that was diverted from somewhere else, and this carries on. I mean, one both scholarly but also just interesting question is how is it that the translator in the early Middle Ages of Saint Maximus the Confessor from Greek into Latin is John Scotus Eriugena, an Irish monk. I mean,
How does
why
that
should he have
happen?
exactly? Why does he know Greek when Greek is not common in the West at that stage? Why does he choose Saint Maximus of all people to translate? What is the resonance there that makes him think this is an important work to which I have to dedicate a great deal of my thought time? I find that incredible. Now, I'm sure that the strict historical theologian will be able to identify, links and connections and causes and reasons. I haven't spent my academic time answering that question, so, I demur. But I think if you have a spiritual instinct for what that might say about the British Church, the insular church, including Britain and Ireland, your instinct may not be far off. That's what I would say from a religious point of view. Um, but then what happens at the Reformation? Take a look at the first Book of Common Prayer, the Book of Common Prayer published in 1549. On one hand, it's basically an early modern English version of the Sarum Missal, the primary use of the Latin Rite in Britain at the time. But without even going much deeper, you soon notice that Cranmer, the architect of the Book of Common Prayer, has added an explicit epiclesis, and that the closing prayer of the both morning and evening prayer, so matins and vespers, is called in the prayer book the Prayer of Saint Chrysostom, which is actually the concluding prayer of um, the small litany after the second antiphon in the Divine Liturgy of Saint John Chrysostom. Now, why on earth is the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1549 drawing very clearly on Greek sources like that as an antidote or as a foil to Western influence, to Roman influence more specifically? There seems to be some kind of resonance and some kind of legacy of Greek memory through the English tradition. After the Reformation, you get the Caroline Divines, Jeremy Taylor, George Herbert, Lancelot Andrewes. You'll recognize some of these figures as being the poets of the age, George Herbert in particular. And um, you know, when Nicholas Losky, the son of Vladimir Losky, writes his PhD thesis in Paris, what is his topic? Lancelot Andrewes the Preacher, the mystical theology of the Church of England.
Hmm.
This is Nicholas Losky writing in Paris, examining the work of a Caroline Divine, in other words, a 17th century Anglican theologian. Incredible. Finally, the non-jurors, the bishops who could not carry on their ministry in light of the reign of King William and Queen Mary, to whom do they turn for episcopal recognition? The Patriarch of Moscow. They don't go to Rome. They go looking to the Orthodox Church. Now, it's only because of the intervention of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had a thing in for the non-jurors, that the Patriarch of Moscow refused to recognize them. But that doesn't undermine the fact that it was to the Orthodox world that they turned. 200 years later, less than 200 years later, John Mason Neale, 19th century Anglo-Catholic, becomes known as the translator of all the ancient hymns from Greek and Latin into English. He spends his short life working on a history of the Holy Eastern Church. There's just this constant, it's like relay towers or relay cell towers or whatever. It's this constant appearance across Anglican church history of Orthodox influence, of Orthodox memory.
Seeds being planted.
Yep. And it's
And
that on which I grow up. It's that informs me from my childhood.
and now we have you, and thank God for that, huh?
Thank God indeed.
And this question I have kind of relates to this topic. I've done my own studies into this, but I feel like when people hear this terminology, which seems to be resurfacing after a number of decades now. This is a question I would not normally ask a Greek because I feel like I'm going to get a more charitable answer on it from you.
Right.
Um, what exactly is the Latin captivity and what effect did it have on the Orthodox Church?
Um, I may not be much better than the Greeks when it comes to this one. I think
At least a little better, I would think, because it's like if I, I won't even let people ask me this question. It's like, listen, ask somebody that's going to be nicer about this. So,
I think as Rome grows too big for its britches, this happens before the 11th century. We know that the difficulties presented by Rome really begin to arise in late antiquity. You know, you look at a saintly figure like uh, Gregory the Dialogos, who is known in the West as Saint Gregory the Great, and you see somebody of incredible spiritual wisdom. Now, it's not like it just disappears after him, but you get diminishing returns from the popes of Rome in subsequent centuries. And
especially in
um,
the medieval period.
absolutely. And, by the time of the schism, Rome's arrogance is fairly full blown, but it reaches its peak under, I think, Innocent III. Now, Innocent III is a figure who will be well known to Westerners, but who asserts a papal authority essentially way beyond any scriptural warrant, any patristic warrant. And it's then that you start to see Rome as um, Rome's self view as arbiter of all things Christian, East and West. Now, there are various political events that unfold, not least of which include the Crusades, but equally, alongside the Crusades, the various sort of maneuverings that are happening in the Eastern Mediterranean world for which Rome's power is called upon, not its church power, but its military power, and the Holy Roman Empire. It's really quite an interesting, if you like military history, it's an interesting kind of dynamic. But all of it lends to pumping up the Pope of Rome's sense of self and Rome's sense of importance in the church.
And sending the tentacles of that influence everywhere else.
Absolutely. This um, this means that when it looks upon sort of orthodoxy, it sees um, an errant younger sibling. It's not like it doesn't recognize the Christianity of the East, but it sees it as errant and in need of being brought back in.
And not as our equal, interestingly enough, even though we're older than them in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. I mean, equality among the apostolic sees and among the apostles is not a notion that would ever occur to Rome. And so, when the Jesuits um, sort of rise as a power within the church, uh, really across the 16th century, and Rome is fighting the Reformation with the Counter-Reformation, and you've really got um, you really um, it starts setting its sights on wherever it can recover what it sees as its former strength and its rights. And Eastern Europe is one of its targets, right? So the Jesuits, Polish Jesuits in particular, start pushing up against the eastern border, or from an Orthodox point of view, the western border, and working their way into the local consciousness and undermining orthodoxy, its tenets, its liturgical life, and really everything about it. And that's where we get the Uniate origins, the origins of the Eastern Catholic churches, so called. because it was an attempt on the part of um, perhaps well-meaning, but ultimately wrong-headed Orthodox, that by entering into communion, by accepting papal supremacy, somehow they would be able to maintain their orthodoxy. Um, and of course, that wasn't to be the case. All it did was throw that part of the world into even further chaos. It may have, and I say may, have arrested the further advance of Latinism into the Christian East, however. So maybe there's that. Having said so, um, the Latin captivity extended everywhere, and even the suppression of the rites, the additional rites, other than the Roman rite, after at the Counter Reformation, uh, the Rome meant that the Roman Church was extending its particular power. So I mentioned when I was talking about the Book of Common Prayer of 1549 how it was based on the Sarum Rite. Well, the Sarum Rite was the Roman Rite, but adapted. It was local. There was something particularly British about it,
Culturally
and that was
evolved.
suppressed. Yeah, absolutely. But that was suppressed in favor of what? In favor of a strict interpretation of the Roman Rite as it was used in Rome. And the same thing happened to the Gallic Rite and the Mozarabic Rite, although I think that's permitted for use today. There were only a tiny handful of very specific rites that were allowed to continue after the Counter-Reformation. So, that kind of, um, I don't know, call it a dictatorial worldview pertained. Um, it started growing in the early Middle Ages, but really came to dominate by the time of the Reformation. And it culminates ultimately, I think, in the First Vatican Council of the 19th century, where there is actually, written in to the acta of the council and I'm only going to paraphrase, but is essentially um, the Pope is the supreme bishop of the church with absolute pastoral, um, juridical, and whatever responsibility for every diocese. Then the next line, notwithstanding that, it's a diocesan bishop is a real diocesan bishop, and you're sitting there reading this,
Those two
going,
things conflict with each other completely.
yeah, it's like saying 2 + 2 = 5. Notwithstanding this, in every classroom where 2 + 2 = 4 is taught, it's still true, but we assert the right to say that 2 + 2 = 5. And you're like, there is no logic to this at all. It's logically absurd. It's theologically absurd. It's simply absurd. So it's very hard to be objective when talking about the Latin captivity because it ultimately leads to what a friend recently called, and which I swore I would steal from him, a papal cult.
Yeah.
A cultus whereby um, the only thing that matters is your subscription to the papacy.
And, this is one of my great fears when people start talking about the potential for reunification.
Mm.
And the reason that the idea of that right now is so scary is because if you approached any Roman archbishop or cardinal or the Pope himself and uttered the words first among equals only, that would drive them crazy. And it's like, you know, I mean, like you articulated before, I think it's a pride issue, and I think it's this need for absolute control, which is unbiblical. And I am one to think that when we think about Peter's confession to Christ, that the church was built not only upon his confession, but also upon the See of Rome. But that has its limits, and I don't. And once they fell into heresy, then it got shifted over, and um, it's a strange conversation to have, and I don't think anybody right now knows how to have it with people that don't want to have it. I think that's kind of where it lays. which is something certainly, but it's my prayer that, either we absorb all of the Roman Catholics or reunite in a way that still allows us to be Orthodox. But one way or another, we have to love these people. These are not our enemies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean the vast majority of Catholics I know love Christ and want to serve him. And I mean, that isn't to be diminished or taken away from them. The fact, I mean, like any sincere believer, really anywhere, if you're born into something, you're not, you're not, the thing into which you're born might be in error, but you as an individual are not in error, if that makes any sense. Um, Furthermore, I would say that, you know, it's there is much that could be found in common. You know,
Oh,
the love of
absolutely.
Christ, the veneration of the Holy Mother of God. You know, all of these things are points of contact without a doubt. But as I think it's Gandalf who says in Lord of the Rings of the relationship between Sauron and Saruman, you know, Sauron does not share power. And you know, really, he could be talking about the Roman See.
Yeah, and when I think about the relationship between Rome and Orthodoxy, even their heresies were not things that they just amalgamated out of thin air. Like what we consider their wrong beliefs were things that they extrapolated out of our right beliefs. Purgatory is their false articulation of what we do with mnemosynon services, with memorial services. Why would we pray for the dead if, if the ones that go to heaven and the ones that go to hell are stuck there? We still pray for
Mhm.
the dead because there's a possibility for them to get out. They have made it into something else. The Immaculate Conception. Um, how in the Orthodox tradition we believe that the Virgin Mary, just like Saint John the Baptist and the prophet Jeremiah, were purified in the womb. They take it a step further in an above and beyond kind of way that it becomes false theology, but there is precedent for their line of thinking. We could think about original sin and penal substitutionary atonement, which are in their own ways very orthodox, which they have misconstrued. And the chief, I would say, of what the Orthodox would call the chief heresy separating Rome and Orthodoxy being filioque, where we understand that the Holy Spirit is in some way manifested through Christ, but it does not proceed from him in the same way that it proceeds from the Father. It still happens. So, these not I guess innovations, but these corruptions of what we believe that are instituted into their theology are things that we could bring them back and say, listen, you kind of sort of almost not really had the right idea, but we are so alike that you could come back here and be comfortable.
Um, an Orthodox priest said to me many years ago, and he was just being,
Did I
you know,
sound
this.
crazy for any of that? I'm sorry. I was just kind of putting that all out.
No, no, no. That's part of conversation, and I don't think he sounded crazy. So no worries. But this priest said to me years ago, and please bear in mind context because it was just said in fun. But he said it's not like we Orthodox think, you know, the Roman Catholic Church is dead wrong on most of its thought. It's just it never knows when to shut up.
Yeah.
And there's a deep truth to that. You know, it's just like, you know, we can't just accept the fact that the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. We have to scientifically prove it and then go into great lengthy descriptions of how that happens. Whereas in Orthodoxy, it's enough to declare truthfully that the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. We don't have a science behind it. Whereas of course, Catholic tradition is such that that's exactly what they have behind it.
So this is kind of another question I have, and it pretty much exactly relates to what you just told me. The term transubstantiation.
Hmm.
All it means is the transformation of the substance of the Eucharist with the accidents remaining. Now I've seen a lot of heard and seen and spoken to a lot of Greek theologians who buck back aggressively against that term. My question is that if it's just a descriptor, what's the problem with it, if there is one?
I'm going to answer this from a personal point of view. The problem is that it makes materialist assumptions.
Mm,
Um, if you live in with a materialist worldview, then you have to explain the correspondence between the material and the spiritual. Whereas, I like to think, but I think I'm not wrong on this. Orthodoxy, having grown up in a different philosophical environment, but equally having been informed by, the Holy Spirit and retained its first lessons, does not subscribe to a material assumption from the outset. So it doesn't even need to look for these conciliatory or synthetic phrases. I buck against the idea of transubstantiation and other, Western definitions, such as the Lutheran consubstantiation and all the various stantiations, precisely because they're wholly unnecessary from an Orthodox point of view.
hmm
Because, it's kind of like, actually, they fall into the same trap that the radical atheists of the earlier part of this century fell into. They actually accept a materiality of reality, sort of the exclusive materiality of reality, as the default truth. But we don't, or at least we're not supposed to, when we have an Orthodox worldview.
So we shouldn't be making spiritual things material, is what condensively you're saying.
Yeah, essentially. Um,
I
you
could roll
know,
with that. Yeah.
yeah, when we wake up in the morning, we know that we look in the mirror, we know that there's a physical being to see and with teeth to brush, etc. We don't and we know that that being is related to God. We bear his image. We correspond with him through prayer, through experience, through if we were to stop and start talking about our cellular structure and then try to figure out how those cells somehow relate to the truth that we hopefully embody in our very being, that is um, our divine parentage, we're not going to actually be very successful. It's going to become a fruitless and ultimately frivolous pursuit. And therefore, we actually just get on with our day, praying, living, being the spiritual children with a physical incarnation.
I see
That
exactly what you're saying, and it's a very good point.
yeah.
Yeah, because when you start over analyzing things, you could push yourself into atheism. And I've seen it
Mhm.
happen to people. I know
Per-
exactly what that turns into.
Yeah, yeah.
Very interesting. But back to you, because I'm more interested in you right now. Um, in your time as a clergyman, and I kind of want to ask this spreading across your denominations, what would you consider the most impactful or striking moment or event?
A couple of things. The first was when I first moved to Saskatchewan. Remember, I'm going to put this in air quotes, but I'd had a failed experience in the West Indies. And when I went to northern Saskatchewan, my bishop then, Bishop Anthony, said, "Look, you're coming on here, but I want you to commit to 5 years at least." He said, "So many of the people that come up here, because it's rural, because it's isolated, they want to move on really quickly." He said, "But you're coming here to work out your sense of vocation, and I will support you in that, but I want you to commit to at least 5 years." So I said, "Good, I did." But as soon as I did, I knew that no matter what I faced, I had to figure out, I had to work through. And what that meant for a boy who grew up in the city, a city kid from Winnipeg, which is in the dead center between east and west. It's a city that bears some characteristics from Montreal, Toronto, the great eastern cities, but many of the characteristics of the Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver's of the west. Um, I knew nothing of the rural northwest of Canada, and instinctively I wasn't interested. I wanted access to my beautiful olives to be bought at any corner shop in Montreal. I wanted access to Quebecois beers, and basically I wanted Eastern culture, and I was a reluctant Westerner.
I know what
Having
you
spent,
mean, but did you get used to village life eventually? Because it's nice in some ways.
yeah, I wouldn't say I find it nice, but I will say this, because Bishop Anthony made me commit, he made me learn what it was to incarnate where I was and to learn to love it. So that was the most important lesson I would say I took away from that place. I realized that actually, a little bit like marriage, as soon as you face a hardship, you're betraying your spouse, you're betraying yourself, you're betraying God, the community by running off. And and being a priest in a place is a bit like that. I have to say that, my ancestry is 100% German. And when I go over to Germany, which I try to do with some frequency, I feel very much at home. But Germany is not where God's put me. Wales is where God has put me. And it's incumbent on me, therefore, to look for the beauty, the truth, the goodness, and to live it as best I can, and to love where I am, and to love the people that God puts into my care. And I do not say that lightly, because I spent the first couple of years of my life in northern Saskatchewan kind of rejecting it, but knowing I shouldn't be because I'd made a commitment. And eventually I started to realize, oh my goodness, I started to see the light, the color, the goodness, the beauty, the truth in the lives of the people there. Now, if you gave me a menu of places to pick to return to no, I probably wouldn't pick going back. But if God put me back there, I would try to do exactly the same thing all over again. Learn to love the people and the place where you are, because who else did that? The model on whom our priesthood is based, the incarnate Logos. That's exactly what God does. He takes on flesh in a particular time, at a particular place, among a particular people. And if he walked around going, oh, I prefer the olives in heaven, it wouldn't have been a very congenial ministry, right? Instead, he gives everything, including his life. And I think, I know personally I had to learn that. And that would be momentous for me. So I'm grateful. I remain grateful to Bishop Anthony for really forcing that lesson on me. Um, and then people talk about religion as being a search for fatherhood very often, especially for these, for young men, they're online, they discover orthodoxy and they think that all of their answers are going to, all of their questions will be answered. And there's a truth to that.
In a sense,
But
yeah.
psychologically, you can look at that and say, it's a search for fatherhood, right? Well, I grew up with a father who loved me. I grew up with a father who had an immense sort of faith, not an immense piety, an immense faith. Just a man who was positive about the world and positive about his children and somebody who let us be who we were. So I've never felt a psychological need for a replacement dad, but I landed in Paris on the 16th of December 2020, as I said, to be received into the church. I arrived about 5 hours late because there was a delay at Heathrow. I ended up getting to Rue de Rue, as it's called in English. I ended up getting to the cathedral um, very late at night. And one of the proto-deacons who was rushing out said, "Look, my children are inside in a flat. They'll give you a cup of tea and they'll sort of direct you to where your room is." And I'm sitting there having tea with them. Now, bear in mind, I've been on the road by that time for about 20 hours. I'm wearing torn jeans. I'm in a t-shirt. My hair is greasy. I feel awful and I'm exhausted. There's a knock on the door. And the young man who was, sort of hosting me and giving me a cup of tea goes to the door and he comes rushing back and he goes, "It's His Eminence." Metropolitan Jean had come down from his flat, which was on a couple of floors above, to see if I'd arrived and to meet me. And I just blanched. I was, oh my goodness. I mean, I feel awful. I look awful. I'm nervous. There are all sorts of things running through my mind. And yet, he comes to the kitchen door where I'm seated. I didn't even have 2 seconds to process any of this. I stand up with my hands out to receive his blessing. And all he says is, ah, in very broken English. I love it when he tries to speak English because it's not good, but it's very endearing. He says, "Ah, Father James, I've wanted to meet you for so long." And he takes my head in his hands and he kisses me on the crown of my head. And I thought, because my father died in 2015, I thought, this is a true father in God. It was I couldn't believe the way he received me. There were no, I mean, he is, you know, a metropolitan archbishop, and he treated me like I felt like the prodigal son returning home. And wonderfully, I can tell you, since that day, he's not been any different. He didn't just put that on for an initial meeting. He's the same person. And I'm sure he's not perfect because there's no bishop on earth that is. Um, but from my point of view, he's been a faithful, humble, and wonderful spiritual father. So that would be my other. So learning the lesson I did in Saskatchewan and being met by my father and God in Paris.
And I'm sure that set an example for you on how to be welcoming and charitable and hospitable to people that come to you for spiritual advice and spiritual fatherhood as well.
I like to think it has. I certainly hope it has and pray it has because, you know, when you and I first started talking, I mentioned, walking down the street in my cassock and passing people. All of these people are fundamentally our brothers and sisters. They're fellow children of God, a God that loves us, and we need to approach them that way. Because if they run up against obstacles, if they run up against closed doors, if they run up against, you know, closed arms, how how are they going to meet Christ in the midst of that? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And when we start sincerely feeling that way about the people around us is one more confirmation that the grace of the Holy Spirit is guiding us. That
Mm,
is an absolute identifier as far as I'm concerned.
yeah.
Um, Now, concerning, like you just kind of talked about, your position in the priesthood, simply put, what would you say is your favorite part about being a priest and why?
Um, I think that experience of knowing that there's a huge weight on your shoulders, and yet the Holy Spirit speaks for you anyway. So I'll give you an example. Hearing confessions. When you stand on the altar to serve the Divine Liturgy, you have a script that the church gives you. So you know that as you call upon the Holy Spirit in the epiclesis during the anaphora, that that something is happening, that God is working through your hands to make this real. But when you're at the confession stand, you don't have the same comfort. You have this incredible sense of responsibility to speak words of Christ to somebody who has been humble enough and repentant enough to come forward. And that can be overwhelming. Like
It's
that's an
scary before
incredible.
you do it, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And and yet, because you can't prepare for it, being able to actually speak something that helps them, that is meaningful to them in the midst of their challenges, in the midst of their struggles, you just know it's not you speaking. And so knowing that somehow you're just a vessel is an overwhelming, it gives you an overwhelming sense of grace and privilege. Now, believe it or not, I would extend that to the same scenario I've already appealed to a few times in our discussion, but that is walking down the street in your cassock. I don't always wear my cassock because sometimes I'm just dad, you're right, and I go out with my kids, and of course I'm not going to uh, inflict them with a football kicking father in a cassock. That would just be absurd, and my kids would be the laughing stock. Having said so, when I do walk down the street through the neighborhood and I go into a pub or whatever, and I am, very clearly dressed as a priest, it's the similar kind of sense because however failed I am, however much my head might be somewhere else, however much, I might be cranky or whatever, it doesn't matter. To that person in that place, at the very least, I stand out uh, and represent something they may not understand. At best, they may actually recognize me immediately as a priest and realize that, this person somehow is meant to represent Christ in that place and at that moment. And so you carry that with you very seriously. And I find that I'm going to use an Americanism here, but I find that awesome. Like
Isn't
I
it
just
awesome?
I absolutely, and I can't believe it. I can't believe I go out the door and to those who see me or to those who see a priest out and about, that is a reality. And so it's a call to, greater consciousness, but it's also a tap on the shoulder of just how much a blessed privilege it is.
Yeah. I mean, let's face facts. It's like being a participant in the spiritual warfare and fighting off temptation are hard enough. So I think I think like I mentioned a little bit before, one of the gifts that God gives us as Christians is the temporal piece of just being able to walk on air. We don't got to worry about anything. He takes care of every detail of who we are that we are inefficient at and don't have direct control over. I've
Mm,
seen it through myself and this is not I'm scum. Let me just say that first and
mm,
foremost. But when people ask me about theology and spirituality, it's pretty obvious that the person I was 15 minutes prior and the person talking to them is not the same, and it is Christ speaking through me. It's
right.
not it is not of my own volition or will or achievement. It is all him. And that's kind of what the position of the priesthood is like as well. The priests are not Christ because they have made themselves like Christ. They are Christ because Christ dwells within them. And
Mm,
the people we see around us are Christ because the icon of Christ dwells within them, and we are obligated to see everyone as an icon of the Lord and treat them as such. So it's
right.
nice. We have a lot of fun over here. It's good being a Christian. I'll say it that much.
Indeed, indeed.
Um, so what did I want? So I mean, I guess we talked about that stuff already. I guess the only thing left that I have to ask you is, concerning the Anglicans and the Catholics, what do you think our responsibility is as Orthodox Christians? What can we do to help bring them back home, and what's our role in that process?
The f- I'll begin by saying what it isn't, or at least what I think it is not, and that is polemics. I
Yes.
don't think polemics helps anyone. I I was privileged to have grown up the way I did. So I retain a strong love for Anglicanism, and when I say that, I hope it doesn't sound trite
Absolutely
because
not. I understand.
I just keep drawing on the information I gained as a young person, as an early priest, and I'm grateful for it. So when I encounter Anglicans today, you know, you might gently point out where things might be missing, and but equally enforce where there are things in common, because it's precisely those things that will bring an Anglican to the threshold in the first place. Um, and say, you can speak personally. In my case, I can say I found my Anglicanism fulfilled in Orthodoxy. And I think that that is an invitation open to all. I suppose that's language I would apply everywhere. Slightly different with Catholics. Ostensibly, we share more in common with them, but I think really there might be less there than we think, because there is a polemical wall between us, one that needs dismantling. Now, I think my biggest issue is, the role of the papacy and how to overcome that. Because if you look online, if you look at the online, I won't even um, credit them with the word conversation. If you look at the online shouting matches and mutual accusations, you'll see that for Catholics, the papacy is a bottom line and probably also a top line. And I think it's a matter really of serving up the reminder that at the top of our ecclesial pyramid is and must always be Christ. That Christ is the vicar. He doesn't need another vicar. His bishops are those to whom he has delegated responsibility for assuring the continuance of his supreme priesthood. But there is, if you think about that as, Christ as the top layer of the pyramid, the pinnacle, that's unitary. You can't have two separate unitaries, right? And really, I think faith is enriched when we realize that. And so that's where I think the meeting point with Roman Catholics has to be, in talking about actually the freedom that comes, the joy that comes with looking to Christ first and foremost, and his servants, the bishops, as enablers in that relationship. Because the extra layer actually kind of undermines the model and actually has pastoral implications for how we live our lives at
I
home, in
agree.
the parish, and in the community.
Father, I couldn't agree more, and I honestly can't thank you enough for coming on and talking to us today. Do you have any final message for the audience, and would you mind ending us off with a prayer?
The message I would leave the audience is the message of the patron saint of my country, Saint David, whose final words to his disciples were, "Do the little things you have seen me done, be joyful, keep the faith." And I might double that one up as a prayer as well, but I think simply an invocation of the holy name of the Trinity will draw it all to a close. So, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. And in our next episode, we will speak to Father Paul Abernathy, and eventually we will continue our readings of Wounded by Love, the life and the wisdom of Elder now Saint Porphyrios, to Father Jacob and to all our listeners. Panagia Mazisu, may our Lord Jesus Christ and his Blessed Mother and all the saints watch over you all the days of your lives, and we will talk to you all later. Απολύας ως φύση ο Θείος μου Υιός, σιγά κατάγγισε όλος τη αμαρτία και παρεδόθης τελείως τη ραφημία της εξαναστήσης σε κείμενο.
Kyrie Iisus Christe eleison, 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 Kyrie Iisus Christe eleison.